The sky above Normandy was the color of old blood. I remember standing in that landing craft, June 6, 1944, water slapping against the metal hull like desperate hands. 23 men pressed shoulder to shoulder, and I could hear every one of them breathing, sharp, shallow, terrified. My brother Thomas stood 3 men down from me, close enough that I could see his knuckles white around his rifle, but too far for me to reach him. The ramp would drop in seconds. The channel crossing had taken hours, each one stretching longer than the last. Men had prayed, others had vomited until there was nothing left. Some had written last letters on scraps of paper, addresses already smudged with seawater and sweat. I'd watched Thomas do the same, his hands steady even as the boat pitched and rolled. He was writing to Sally, the girl back home who wore his ring and waited for promises we might not live to keep. Thomas turned his head just slightly, caught my eye through the smoke and spray. He didn't smile. Neither did I. We'd made a promise to each other back in Pennsylvania, standing in our mother's kitchen with the enlistment papers still warm in our hands. We go together, we come home together. That's what we'd said. That's what we'd sworn. Ma had cried, held us both, made us swear again on the family Bible. We'd sworn. The engines roared. Someone vomited. The lieutenant shouted something I couldn't hear over the thunder of artillery pounding the beach ahead. I could smell cordite and salt and fear, all mixed together into something that burned in my throat. Then the ramp fell, and hell opened its mouth. I hit the water, and it was colder than anything I'd ever known. The shock of it stole my breath, made my muscles seize. Bullets snapped overhead, punching through the air with that horrible whip-crack sound they never tell you about in training. Men were screaming. Men were falling. Bodies floated face down in the surf, rolling with each wave. I pushed forward through chest-deep water. Rifle held high, legs burning, lungs screaming for air I couldn't catch. Somewhere in that chaos, I lost sight of Thomas. The beach was chaos made solid. Smoke, fire, bodies in the surf. Medics dragging wounded men toward cover. Tanks burning. The air tasted like metal and death. I threw myself behind a tank obstacle, pressed my face into the sand, and tried to remember how to breathe. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold my weapon. Around me, soldiers were moving, firing, dying. The world had narrowed to this single strip of blood-soaked sand, and nothing beyond it seemed real anymore. Someone grabbed my shoulder. Sergeant Williams, his face covered in grime and someone else's blood. "Move! Keep moving!" he shouted. Though I could barely hear him over the guns, I moved. We all moved. What else could we do? I found Thomas an hour later. He was crouched in a crater with 4 other men, reloading with mechanical precision, his face gray with exhaustion and fear. Blood streaked his cheek, though I couldn't tell if it was his. When he saw me, something shifted in his expression. Relief. Or maybe just the memory of relief, from a world where relief still meant something. "Thought I lost you," he said. Voice hoarse. "Not yet," I told him. One of the men in the crater was crying silently, tears cutting clean lines through the dirt on his face. Another stared at nothing, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. We were all just boys playing at being soldiers, and the game had turned deadly serious. We pushed inland as the sun climbed higher, turning the smoke red, then gold, then red again. By nightfall, we'd made it half a mile. In those 6 hours, I'd seen more death than in all my 21 years combined. I'd learned that bodies don't fall like they do in movies. I'd learned what a man sounds like when he calls for his mother. I'd learned that courage and terror can live in the same heartbeat. Thomas and I dug in together that night, sharing a foxhole barely wide enough for 1 man, let alone 2. We didn't talk. What was there to say? Instead, we passed a cigarette back and forth, listening to the wounded calling out in the darkness, waiting for stretcher bearers who might never come. Above us, the sky was clear for the first time all day, stars appearing one by one like tiny wounds in the darkness. "You remember what Ma said?" Thomas whispered finally. "About staying together?" I nodded in the dark. "We're keeping that promise," he said. No matter what, I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. That was the night I realized promises made in kitchens don't carry much weight in hell. We spent 3 weeks pushing through the hedgerows of France. They called it bocage country. Centuries-old walls of earth and root and stone, each one a fortress, each one hiding German soldiers who knew every inch of that land. The hedgerows rose 12 feet high, thick as castle walls, and turned every field into a death trap. It was slow, grinding, murderous work. You'd take one field, lose 6 men, then move to the next and lose 6 more. The math never worked in our favor. Thomas changed in those weeks. We all did, I suppose. War has a way of filing down the soft edges of who you used to be, leaving only the hardcore that knows how to survive. But I watched it happen to him up close, saw the light in his eyes dim a little more each day. He stopped talking about home, stopped mentioning Sally, the girl he'd been planning to marry, stopped asking me what I wanted to do after the war. The future became a luxury we couldn't afford to imagine. He just fought. The company lost half its strength in those 3 weeks. Replacements arrived, fresh-faced boys who didn't know enough to be properly afraid yet. We tried to teach them, tried to keep them alive. Most of the time we failed. Their names blurred together after a while. Faces I couldn't quite remember even a day after they were gone. One afternoon, after we'd cleared a small village called St. Lo, we found a farmhouse still standing. Inside there was a photograph on the mantel. A family, mother, father, 3 children, all smiling at some moment in a past that seemed impossibly distant now. The house was empty otherwise. No furniture, no food, just that single photograph, left behind like a ghost. Thomas picked it up, studied it for a long time. "You think they made it out?" he asked. I didn't answer. The question felt too big, too dangerous. If I started wondering about the people who'd lived in these houses, worked these fields, loved in these rooms, I'd never stop wondering. I'd drown in all that wondering. He set the photograph down carefully, like it was made of glass. I used to think about what I'd tell my kids someday, about the war, about being brave. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Now I just want to make sure there's someone left to have kids with. I understood. We all did. The war was eating away at our futures, consuming them one day at a time. That night, we got new orders. Intelligence reported a German position 3 miles east, dug in near a crossroads. Command wanted it taken before dawn. Our company drew the assignment. What was left of our company anyway? 40 men where there should have been 200. We moved out at 200 hours. 40 men creeping through darkness so complete you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Thomas walked point with Lieutenant Morrison. I was 6 men back, close enough to hear them whispering, too far to help if something went wrong. The night air was cool, almost pleasant after the heat of the day. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. It seemed impossible that owls still existed in a world like this. Maybe I already knew then. Maybe some part of me recognized the shape of what was coming. The ambush hit us at 0340. Machine gun fire ripped through our column from 3 directions. Muzzle flashes lit up the night like lightning, freezing everything in strobe light moments of horror. Men dropped instantly, others dove for cover. I hit the ground so hard I saw stars, rolled into a ditch, came up firing blindly into the darkness. The muzzle flash from my rifle blinded me, turned the world into fragments of light and shadow. The firefight lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, when the guns finally fell silent and the ringing in my ears became the only sound in the world, I counted heads, 37. We'd started with 40. Thomas wasn't among them. I found him 20 yards up the road, dragged into cover by Morrison. He was conscious, breathing hard, holding his side. Blood soaked through his uniform, black in the pre-dawn light. His face was pale, lips pressed thin against the pain. "It's not that bad," he said when he saw me. "Just caught some fragments." It was bad. Morrison had already called for a medic, but we were 3 miles from the nearest aid station and still in contested territory. We'd have to wait for first light, then move him back under cover. I pressed my hands against the wound, felt warm blood pulse between my fingers. Thomas gripped my wrist, held tight. "Remember the promise," he said. "Shut up," I told him. "You're going home." "We both are." He smiled then, just slightly. "You always were a terrible liar." They evacuated Thomas at dawn. 2 medics carried him back on a stretcher while I walked alongside, one hand on his shoulder, trying not to think about how pale he'd gotten, or how shallow his breathing had become. He drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling things I couldn't quite hear. Once he said Sally's name. Once he said Ma. Once he said something about the creek behind our house where we used to fish as boys. Something about summer afternoons that felt like they belonged to different people entirely. At the field hospital, they took him from me. A doctor with exhausted eyes and blood on his apron told me to wait outside. I sat on an empty ammunition crate and watched the sun climb higher, turning the sky from gray to blue to the hard bright white of midday. Around me, wounded men lay on stretchers, some quiet, some screaming. Medics moved between them like ghosts, doing what they could, which was never enough. A chaplain moved among the dying, offering prayers and holding hands. 3 hours later, the doctor found me. "He'll live," he said, "but he's going home. That wound got infected. We're shipping him to England, then back to the States." Relief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. My knees went weak. My vision blurred. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than fear or exhaustion, or the grinding certainty of death. Thomas was awake when I went in to see him. Pale, weak, but alive. His eyes found mine, and something passed between us. Guilt, maybe, or gratitude, or the complicated mess of both. He was leaving, going home, while I stayed behind in this hell. He'd keep his half of the promise. I'd have to keep mine alone. "You're getting out," I said. "You lucky bastard," he tried to smile. "Some luck. You get to keep the promise. You get to go home to Ma. Get to marry Sally. Get to have those kids you were talking about." "What about you?" I didn't have an answer for that. Didn't want to think about finishing this war without him beside me. Didn't want to imagine all the battles still to come. All the fields and towns and rivers we'd have to cross, and doing it alone. They shipped him out the next morning. I stood and watched the truck roll away, taking my brother back towards something resembling safety, and I felt something tear loose inside my chest. It wasn't grief. It was worse than grief. It was the understanding that I'd be finishing this war alone, that the promise we'd made had been broken not by death, but by survival. The company moved out 3 days later. We pushed deeper into France, then into Belgium, then into Germany itself. Summer turned to autumn. Autumn turned to winter. The cold settled into our bones and never left. We fought through towns whose names I couldn't pronounce, cleared buildings room by room, buried our dead in frozen ground that resisted every shovel blow. The war ground on, day after day, week after week, until time itself seemed to lose meaning. I stopped counting the days. Time became measured in different units now. Firefights, casualties, letters from home. I got one from Thomas in November. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. He was stateside, recovering in a hospital in Virginia. Sally had visited him. They were planning to get married as soon as he was well enough. Ma sent her love. Everyone back home was praying for me. He asked if I was keeping safe. I didn't write back. What would I say? That safety was a concept that stopped meaning anything? That every day I woke up surprised to still be breathing? That I'd watched boys die calling for mothers who would never hear them? That I'd learned to sleep through artillery fire and wake at the sound of a twig snapping? That I wasn't sure there was enough of me left to come home to? In December, we reached a small Belgian town called Bastogne. The Germans had us surrounded. Cut off, no supplies, no reinforcements. Just snow and cold and the certainty that we were going to die there. We dug in and waited. Christmas came and went. Men froze to death in their foxholes. Others lost fingers and toes to frostbite. We burned furniture from bombed-out houses to stay warm, huddled around small fires that did almost nothing against the brutal cold. I thought about Thomas a lot during those days. Wondered what he was doing. Wondered if he was warm. Wondered if he thought about me, trapped in this frozen hell while he sat safe in Pennsylvania or Virginia or wherever they'd sent him to heal. I wasn't angry about it. Anger required energy I didn't have. I just wondered, and sometimes, in the darkest hours of those long nights, I envied him. Not for leaving, but for getting to keep being human. One night, huddled in a basement with 6 other men, someone asked what we'd do first when we got home. "Sleep in a real bed," one man said. "Eat my wife's cooking," said another. "See my daughter," said a third. "She was born a week before I shipped out. I've never even held her." They all looked at me, waiting. "I'm going to keep a promise," I said. We broke out of Bastogne in January. The Germans retreated. We advanced. The war ground on, relentless and impersonal as a machine. By March, we were deep in Germany, moving through towns that had been bombed into moonscapes, past refugees walking roads that led nowhere. Everything was gray. The buildings, the sky, the faces of the people we passed. Even hope seemed to have been bombed into rubble. I'd been at war for 10 months, but it felt like 10 years. The boy who'd enlisted in Pennsylvania didn't exist anymore. He'd died somewhere between Normandy and here, replaced by this hollow thing that knew how to kill and how to survive, but had forgotten almost everything else. I couldn't remember what my mother's voice sounded like. Couldn't remember the smell of fresh bread or the feel of clean sheets. Couldn't remember what it felt like to not be afraid. Then, on a morning when the first signs of spring were beginning to show through the mud and ash, I got the letter. It was from Sally. My hands shook as I opened it, standing in the ruins of what had once been a church. Around me, men cleaned weapons and wrote letters of their own, but I barely heard them. The paper felt impossibly fragile in my dirty hands, like it might crumble to dust at any moment. "Dear James, I don't know how to write this. I've started this letter 6 times and torn it up 5. But you deserve to know. Thomas died yesterday. The world stopped. Everything stopped. The sounds of the camp faded. The ruins around me blurred. I read the words again. Then again. They didn't change. The infection came back. They tried everything, but it was too deep, too far gone. He fought so hard, James. You would have been proud of him. At the end, he asked me to make sure you got this message. He said you'd understand. He said to tell you he kept the promise. He made it home. I don't remember sitting down. I don't remember the hours that passed. When I looked up again, the sun was setting and Sergeant Williams was crouching next to me, hand on my shoulder. The letter was still in my hands, creased and wrinkled where I'd gripped it too hard. Bad news? He asked quietly. I nodded. Family? My brother. Williams didn't say anything. What was there to say? He'd lost people too. We all had. Death was the only thing we had in abundance. After a moment, he squeezed my shoulder and walked away, leaving me alone with the words I couldn't stop reading. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep running from the promise we'd made. Thomas had kept his end. He'd made it home, even if home had killed him in the end. Now I had to keep mine. Not by surviving, not by playing it safe, but by finishing what we'd started together, by making sure his sacrifice meant something. The next morning, I volunteered for every dangerous assignment. Scouting missions, point position, building clearances. My squad mates thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But I moved through those final weeks of war like a ghost, untouchable, invincible. Bullets passed through the air where I'd been standing. Shells exploded in spaces I'd just left. I walked through fire and came out clean. I should have died a dozen times. I didn't. Instead, I survived to see May 8th, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe. Men around me celebrated, cried, laughed, drank. They sang songs and fired their weapons into the air and embraced each other like brothers. I sat alone in a bombed-out factory and tried to feel something other than empty. The war was over. We'd won, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd all lost something we'd never get back. I made it home in July. The ship pulled into New York Harbor on a morning so bright it hurt to look at. Men crowded the rails, shouting, waving at the Statue of Liberty. Some were crying. Others just stared, like they couldn't quite believe they were really here, really home, really safe. I stood at the back, quiet, watching America come into focus through the summer haze. It looked smaller than I remembered, less substantial, like a dream I'd once had that was already fading in the morning light. Ma was waiting at the train station in Pennsylvania. She looked smaller than I remembered too, older, grayer. The war had aged her in ways I hadn't expected. When she saw me, she ran. Actually ran, despite her bad knee and the weight of grief she'd been carrying. Threw her arms around me and held on like she'd never let go. I stood there, stiff, uncertain, trying to remember how to be a son instead of a soldier. You came home, she whispered. Both my boys came home. I didn't correct her. Didn't tell her that the boy who'd left had died somewhere in France. That the man who'd come back was someone else entirely. Someone who didn't know how to live in a world where people weren't trying to kill him. That night, I visited Thomas's grave. They'd buried him in the small cemetery on the edge of town, under an oak tree he used to climb when we were kids. The headstone was simple. His name, his dates, the words, beloved son and brother. Someone had left flowers. Ma, probably. Fresh ones. She'd been coming here every day. I stood there until the sun set, trying to find something to say. Trying to explain why I was here and he wasn't. Trying to make sense of a promise that had been both kept and broken. In the end, I just pressed my hand against the cold stone. We both made it, I whispered, just like we promised. The wind moved through the oak leaves, and for a moment, I could almost imagine it was him, answering, agreeing, forgiving me for surviving when he hadn't. The years that followed were strange. I married a girl from town, not Sally. She'd moved away after Thomas died, couldn't bear to stay in a place that reminded her of what she'd lost. But another girl, a good girl. We had children, built a life that looked normal from the outside. A house, a job, Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and all the ordinary moments that make up a life. But I carried the war with me everywhere. In the way I startled at loud noises. In the way I couldn't sleep without checking the doors and windows. In the dreams that came most nights, pulling me back to those beaches, those hedgerows, those frozen foxholes. In the way I couldn't quite connect with the world around me, like I was watching it all through a thick pane of glass. My wife learned not to wake me suddenly. My children learned that sometimes Daddy needed to be alone. I learned to hide the worst of it, to smile when I was supposed to smile, to pretend I was whole when I was really just pieces held together by will and habit. I never told my children the whole truth about the war. How could I explain that their uncle had died after surviving? That I'd volunteered to die after he'd gone? That some part of me was still standing in that cemetery in Belgium, counting bodies in the snow. That I'd seen things no human being should see, done things no human being should do. But I told them about the promise. I told them that love doesn't stop at the borders of hell. That promises made in kitchens can survive even when the people who made them don't. That sometimes keeping faith is the only victory we get. That your word is the only thing you truly own, and breaking it costs more than dying ever could. Now I'm an old man, and Thomas has been gone longer than he was ever alive. But I still visit his grave every Sunday, rain or shine, summer or winter. I still press my hand against that stone. I still tell him we kept our promise, both of us, in our own ways. Sometimes I wonder what he'd think of the world now, of the life I built, of the children who carry his name even though they never knew him. I wonder if he'd forgive me for all the years I got to have that he didn't. But mostly I just remember him the way he was before the war, before the fear and the mud and the blood. I remember him climbing that oak tree, laughing in the summer sun. I remember him promising to come home. I remember believing him. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Keep the promises. Remember the names. Carry the weight until it's time to set it down and let someone else carry it forward. The war took everything from us except the love. That somehow survived. Who would you still wait for, even if the world was burning? If this story touched your heart, share it so their memory lives on.